I've been sprinkling this into videos for the past year or so now, but I've kind of gotten addicted to the Project Moon games. It's a series of 3 Korean games, a manhwa, and 2 web novels, each taking place in the same setting. The hyper-dystopian nightmare, known simply as The City. 2 AM editing height here. Turns out the Wonderlab is no longer canon, more on that in that comics part of the video. This video is going to be both a glowing endorsement for the series, as well as a huge warning, because I genuinely don't think any of these games were created with human enjoyment in mind. Lobotomy Corporation is a game that I'd known of for years thanks to some friends who'd been, let's just say, obsessed with it ever since it came out. I'd always avoided playing it, no matter how many people told me of its alleged greatness. There was even a point where Tony messaged me once asking me if I'd played it, as he was going through it and actually enjoying it, to which I promptly replied with, and I quote, "No, that game looks like fucking dog shit." Something about the aesthetic put me off, and I've never liked SCP, which this game is directly inspired by. And God knows I hate management simulators of any kind, so playing it was never even a question for me. I didn't think about the game for another year or two until I saw someone playing for Library of Ruina, which immediately caught my eye. I then basically proceeded to immediately download LobCorp to give it a try, as I like to play through series in order of release, not to mention Library of Ruina is a continuation of it. Only for me to drop the game after 15 hours of playing, watching all the cutscenes online and moving on to Ruina. Suffice it to say, I didn't really enjoy my time with this game. The main character is some random guy named X. He, and by extension you the player, is the manager of an underground power production company called Lobotomy Corporation, which, contrary to what its name suggests, does not actually lobotomize anybody. Your goal is to fully expand the facility you're managing within 50 days. Doing this, you're guided by your AI robot assistant, Angela, as well as the Sephora, who each are the head of their respective departments. Sounds simple, right? I wish it was, but it's not. Instead of extracting energy from oil or nuclear fission or some shit, LobCorp instead extracts enkephalin from man-made horrors beyond human comprehension, called abnormalities. That's the easy part, the hard ones containing them. Each day is split into 2 parts. The first is the prep phase. Here you pick your employees and prepare them for the horrors they're about to face. You can do this either by increasing their stats or giving them ego equipment, which is gear extracted from the abnos. Once you've chosen your lambs, you send them to the slaughterhouse in the management phase. Really, all you have to do is send in your employees and tell them how to deal with whichever abno they're dealing with, and hoping you get a lot of enkephalin out of them. Each abnormality has some sort of gimmick attached to it, and you better hope you can figure it out quickly, because if you can't, well... There's 5 types of abnos, ranging from difficult but manageable to fucking impossible. Aside from this goal, your only other real objective is making sure that at least one of your wage slaves makes it out of the day both alive and psychologically sustaining minimal damage. After a while, the Sephora also start having certain requests for you that you have to contend with during the day. Once you're done with all of those, you get a ridiculously difficult boss level of sorts called the Sephora Meltdown that has any and all stakes against you. Doesn't help that the game progressively gets more difficult until I just flat out broke me, and it didn't even take long for that to happen. The thing is, every time you lose, you have the option to reset the game. This lets you start the game over, but with all of the ego, Sephora missions, and information you unlocked on your last run carrying over. But everything else obviously resets. It's kind of like New Game Plus in Dead Rising. 2 resets later, and I eventually just gave up at around, I want to say day 25, which sounds like it would be the halfway point, but assure you, it is not. With the constantly rising difficulty and the inevitability that you'll eventually have to reset at some point, it realistically makes up barely, 25% of completion, and as if that wasn't enough, the game's actual ending is locked behind 100%ing it. Doing that shit requires a lot of patience, dedication, and time, and for a game as infuriating as this one, that just happens to be something I do not possess. Getting past an immensely difficult day is extremely gratifying, and beating every day feels like surviving by the skin of your teeth, but that's kind of because of how luck-based everything is. If I'd had to wager, I'd say that the ratio of luck to skill is 80-20, and the sheer frustration is something that only the most invested are going to be able to stomach. Unfortunately, that's going to be the minority here. The story doesn't really get going until you reach the lower floors of the facility either, and getting there is absolutely grueling. And that's really unfortunate because the story is quite good. I've kind of avoided talking about the story thus far because the way the game slowly unravels in front of you is easily the game's strongest suit. The entire game takes place entirely in the facility. You're never shown what's going on up above, and finding out is one of the game's best aspects, as hints towards it are all over, ranging from the abnormalities, information text to the dialogues of your employees. All the while, X is located solely in his little room with Angela, witnessing everything from a bunch of monitors. The Sephora become more and more hostile to him with every passing day, and Angela's advice turns from emotionless but helpful to cryptic and downright menacing. There's a lot of great things here. It's just a matter of if you're capable of stomaching one of the most ruthlessly player-unfriendly games I've ever played. God knows I'm not. Back in 2020, a companion manhwa, that is to say a Korean webcomic, to LobCorp was released, titled Wonderlab. Similarly to the game, we view most of the story from the perspective of a manager who is checking in on his employees via a series of monitors, while assisted by his AI assistant Angela, who is not the same characters in the game, but an AI copy of her AI. In spite of this, the manager is not the main character. Instead, Wonderlab follows a group of employees of a separate branch to that of the game. Much like any super shady megacorporation with its salt, LobCorp functions from multiple locations, though the MO is always the same. Get a bunch of extremely emotionally unstable people to prod demons of their own creation with a cattle prod until they poop out Duracell batteries. The actual main characters are called Cat, Tai, and Rose. The manager meanwhile doesn't do absolutely anything, unlike X, leaving everyone to their own devices. Wonderlab is most definitely an interesting addition to the series, but truth be told, I don't think it's a particularly important one. Most of its relevant events and information are relegated to a lot of implications, most of which are then reintroduced and expanded upon in either Ruina or Limbus. I also don't particularly like the art, if I'm being honest. It just isn't very appealing to me. If there's any piece of this franchise you could skip, that's most definitely this one. So yeah, turns out that Wonderlab is no longer available as of August 2023. I don't know how that went past me, I just never heard of it, but turns out that there was a big controversy regarding something related to Limbus Company. I didn't really look into it, and because of that, the author and artist for Wonderlab no longer associates with Project Moon. Decided to keep it in the video just for the sake of compilation, but I thought I'd let you all know. Unfortunately, it's completely impossible for me to talk about literally anything else in this series going forward without spoiling some aspects of LobCorp, as all of them take place up on the surface. If you absolutely do not want to see any spoilers for Lobotomy Corporation, then I suggest turning off the video here. I'll try my very best to keep the video as spoiler-free as possible, but just by virtue of the game's events being the main catalyst for everything to come, there's just gonna be some concessions I'm gonna have to make. Sorry. Library of Ruina is quite possibly one of the best games I've played that was released in the last 10 years, and the best part? I didn't even beat it. I cheated at the final boss. We'll get to this later, but I think it's important that we start with the setup to the story before we get to anything else. Turns out that after the events of LobCorp, Angela kinda fucked a lot of things up, and now on the surface where Lobotomy Corp once stood, now lies a gigantic library controlled by none other than Angela herself. Let's just say she's a bit tired of acting like a machine, and has instead decided to act like a white woman. What's on the surface in the first place? Welcome to the city. Population, whatever remains of humanity, presumably. The city is a vacation spot for you if you want to die a horrible death. It's split into 25 districts, each governed by a different megacorporation, or wing, with an initial pertaining to the district's corresponding letter of the alphabet. In the case of Lobotomy Corporation, it's District 12. Internally, the districts are split into two sides. The nests, which encompasses the entire area directly supervised by the wing, and the back streets. Think of these as a ghetto where the likelihood of you being killed and your organs harvested for black market is as high as stepping on a pebble. On top of that, each corporation also has some top secret patented super technology that may or may not be related to some extremely unethical activities. In L-Corp's case, it was the production of enkephalin. Meet Roland, your average, completely normal, everyday grade 9 fixer. A fixer is basically the city's equivalent of a handyman. Depending on how much you pay them, they'll do literally anything. The head of the city grades fixers depending on their skill, with grade 9 being the worst, useful for little more than getting a cat out of the tree, and 1 being the best. There's also color fixers who are so good at what they do that they're basically celebrities. Little unambiguous Roland over here somehow got sent to the library while going to HamHamPangPang, his favorite sandwich store, where he then proceeded to get his limbs torn off and is now worse to fork as Angela's slave. His job is to expand the library by adding more books to it. To do this, the library first sends out invitations to whoever could use the information within the books, where they then have to fight one of the librarians, which means Roland, the Sephora, and a few surviving Lobotomy Corporation employees. Each librarian has their own floor, mirroring the floors in LobCorp, and that's where the gameplay kicks in. Yeah, this is an RPG now. I can't even begin to explain how much more enjoyable this game is to play than LC. It's not even funny. The game is similar to something like Baten Kaitos, wherein your potential actions each turn are a bunch of cards that you put on a deck before the battle starts, of which you pull a random hand. In this game, the cards are book pages, because of course they are, and you can select a total up to 9 per unit, though you can only have a set number of duplicates depending on the page's rarity. At the start of each turn, every character rolls a dice that lands on a random attack number. This determines your speed stat. You can always see who your enemies are going to attack and with what page ahead of time, and your goal is to counter that to the best of your ability. If the die of any of your characters is higher than the attackers, then they get to clash against it, instead of the targeted unit having to tank it. If you can't do that, then the targeted unit can always clash against an attack targeting them no matter what the dice is. And if everyone's die is below the attackers, then you just have to tank it. Each card has different effects to it, like a combo of blunt attacks and slashes, having some dodges throughout it, or for giving out debuffs. Say your enemy is using a page that in this order has a slash attack, another slash attack, and then a shield. Each one of these individually has a hit chance attached to it, with any range of numbers in it. If you clash with a card that has 2 shields and then an attack, it would play out like this. The enemy's first attack clashes against your first shield. Another random die is cast that determines the effectiveness of the attack. If their attack number rolls higher than your shield, then they hit your unit and you take damage. If not, you're safe from harm. And if that wasn't enough, each page has a certain cost attached to it, using the little light dots above your die, of which you gain 1 each turn. There's also this emotion gauge mechanic, which I won't even get into as it's a whole other can of worms. Add to that the sheer abundance of other things, and it turns into an extremely tense battle system that I honestly kind of love. I know this is a lot to take in, and it feels like it's mostly luck dependent, which was one of the core issues of Lob Corp, but whereas luck made up a majority of the success in that game, here it's a matter of both luck and strategy equally. RNG can put you in an extremely bad spot, but if you play your cards right, literally, it's almost always possible to make a comeback. After each cleared stage or reception, you get a bunch of books from your victims. Burning those gets you more cards to use. On one hand, you have the combat pages, which you can add to your deck. On the other, you have key pages. These essentially let you copy-paste the corresponding characters onto your own, giving your librarian all their stats, weaknesses and resistances, and special gimmicks. You can even use the inactive key pages to give their passives to other ones. After progressing the story a certain amount, you eventually get to face abnormalities. Yeah, was hoping I'd never see those again, but I guess not. At least you get to beat the ever-living shit out of them this time. Unlike with the regular encounters where only a handful have gimmicks that are puzzles, every single abnormality battle is essentially one big puzzle. Beating them unlocks 2 things. The first is abnormality pages for the current floor, which are universal supercards of which you can select 1 of 3 after every emotional level raised in battle. The other is a new assistant librarian for the floor, which you can customize in really stupid ways with battle symbols you unlock throughout the game. After finishing every abno battle, you unlock the corresponding floor's realization. In these, Angela gets a bit too emotional, so these are additional boss fights on top of the ones in the main story, and are multi-phase gauntlets where every phase has its own unique gimmick. The bosses in this game, both in and out of the realizations, are easily the highlights of this game. Thematically, musically, and gameplay-wise, these fights are the game's firing on all cylinders. It's kind of like the puzzle aspect of the abnormality battles cranked up to 11. Rarely has a game made me this tense in so many ways at once, and the entire game is a positive feedback loop of growing stronger and being pushed to your limits again and again. So after all this, the game sounds pretty great, right? I mean, we have a perfectly good combat system with great mechanics surrounding it that enhance the narrative. So then why the hell does the game actively try to sabotage itself at every turn? I've been keeping the big criticisms from you this entire time because frankly, they all just feed back into one another. So remember how I said that beating a reception gets you books to burn for pages? Well, you only get a small amount of those, and you need to get a lot of luck to get every card, which in and of itself is fine. The issue arises from how the game structures story progression. See, in order to start a reception, you need to manually send out invitations. To do so, you need to use books obtained from earlier receptions. Do you see the problem here? If you fail a later reception and run out of the necessary books, you'll potentially be forced to go back several stages, all of them with a very real chance of you failing and setting back even further. And the thing is, as the game progresses, that's inevitably going to happen, because the game's difficulty ramps up ridiculous levels later on. There's 7 chapters to the story, and while the first 4 progressively grow more difficult, they're all perfectly manageable. And then you get to Urban Nightmare and the game's difficulty jumps up drastically and only grows from there. There's a reason why half the game's Steam reviews claim that the difficulty curve is vertical, and this is why I never beat the game. The final fight absolutely broke me. It's unrelentingly difficult, and I eventually resorted to cheating to take it out. I cannot begin to explain how infuriating this single mechanic can make the game. There is, thankfully, a mod that gives you virtually infinite copies of every book, and I cannot wholeheartedly recommend anybody play this game without that mod. Unfortunately, those mods are obviously not available on the console versions of the game. And then on the other hand, you have an issue that's more tied to the story. Despite being the main character, Roland gets all of his abnos and his realizations last, with the final ones basically being right at the end of the game. Because of this, the main character of the game is practically totally shafted, as not using any of the floors with more stuff unlocked instead is putting yourself at an unnecessary disadvantage. And the last big problem has to do with the ending. I won't spoil anything, but in short, the early access builds had a special post-credit scene that leads directly into Leviathan, which we'll get to later. This scene is still canon and still relevant, however it's completely inaccessible from the game itself, and you really shouldn't have to go online to find your game's full ending. And so, despite all of the game's huge flaws, I cannot help but adore it, and the core reason really is the story. So let's talk about it. I'm someone who greatly values strong character writing, and Ruina has that in spades. Every single character, be they major or minor, is incredibly well written, and helps the city feel like an actual lived place. And on top of that, the overarching narrative is just excellent. As it turns out, Angela's little stunt at the end of LC caused something called distortions to appear. A distortion is what happens when a person gets a little too emotional and starts starts manifesting an ego of their own, and then gets wholly consumed by it. So, you know, nothing good. They're a constant danger to everyone in the city, and easily one of the setting's best elements, as they add another level to the whole misery fest that is the world. Imagine just going about your day, and then some office worker who got fired turns into a giant monstrosity that kills everyone you know and love. Far and away my favorite character, however, has to be Roland himself, especially in the context of his relationship with Angela and how it develops over the course of the game. See, Roland is based on the Italian epic Orlando Furioso, a sequel to a different author's epic titled Orlando Innamorato, which in itself is based on the French song of Roland, based on the life of the Frankish soldier of the same name. The way the story weaves the epic's narrative into itself is fantastic, and I really can't say more without taking away some of the best moments. And ultimately, this game is just one big advertisement for the restaurant HamHamPangPang, which Roland loves to talk about as mentioned earlier. That's a real place in South Korea and it sells Project Moon themed food. I don't know where else to bring this up, so I'm doing that here. I've made it pretty clear by now that I love this game, and hell, it might just be one of my favorite games period, because despite its unrelenting barrage of flaws, the game is brimming top to bottom with wonderful ideas and some of the best storytelling I've seen in gaming. If you can, I highly encourage you to get the game on PC, download the no grind mods, and enjoy one of the most brutally yet gratifying experiences you'll ever play. And if not, well, I can't exactly blame you. Ruina was actually an early access project, and concurrently with its development, Project Moon put out a web novel simply titled The Distorion Detective. It follows two fixers working under the Mosey's office, those being Mosey's herself, who can physically see the distortion before it fully manifests, and her assistant Ezra. Since Mosey's can see the distortions, the entire novel revolves around her and Ezra going around taking and solving cases related to the distortions. As you'd expect from Project Moon, the writing is excellent, the characters are extremely likable, and they set the mood extremely well. Unfortunately, there is one big issue with Distorion Detective. It's unfinished and it's never gonna be finished either. Well, kind of. See, as the novel grew more and more popular, PM eventually decided to compile their plans for the rest of the story and turn it into a game project. They made this announcement back in July 2021. They also recently admitted that there has been no work done on this game at all. The reason? Limbus Company is hogging on the entire company's resources. We'll get to this later, but man, if Limbus hasn't been the biggest double-edged sword they could have made. What makes this even worse is that one of the side chapters in Limbus pretty much confirmed how the story is going to end, which in my opinion was kind of a misstep for this early on. So as it stands, Distorion Detective is a wonderful side story that's probably never going to be finished in the 5 next years or so, and that's a damn shame. And then on the completely other side of the spectrum, we have Leviathan, the epic of Vergilius the Red Gaze, a direct follow-up to the deleted ending from Ruina, and a direct prequel to Limbus Company, following that game's coolest character, Vergilius. He's the current red color fixer, and chilling in his nest running a little orphanage, only for it to be destroyed on Christmas Eve and all but a few kids dying in the process. After this, Vergilius is thrust into another fixer job that ends up going, let's just say, a bit worse than expected. This one's good, and I mean really good. I don't want to take away anything more than that, because it gets going from chapter 1 and is all around a fantastic read, but unfortunately it's also kind of a pain to go through. The first 11 chapters were made as a webcomic. The art is excellent, the writing is on point, and the story hits just as hard as you'd hope it would. Unfortunately, due to the artist's declining mental health, the remaining chapters 12 to 20 were turned into a web novel. At least this one got finished, unlike Distorion Detective. It was even officially translated, well, until it wasn't. The first 15 chapters were, but after that the entire translation staff was shifted to, you guessed it, Limbus Company. And so, the last 5 chapters had to be translated by fans. Either way, I highly advise reading Leviathan before playing Limbus, as it is crucial to understanding both Vergilius and Karen as characters, adds to the mystery of Faust and the company, and largely explains every major action Vergilius takes in Limbus. So I guess now is as good a time as any to actually discuss the company itself. For all of my upcoming criticisms and praises, it is imperative that I preface it all with one important fact. Limbus Company is a free-to-play gacha game. This game takes place sometime after the ending of Leviathan and starts with our protagonist, Dante, being attacked by 3 schizos before being saved by Vergilius and his comedy troupe of sinners, only for your would-be saviors to, violently die trying. Thankfully, Dante replaced his head with a giant clock, which lets him revive the sinners by absorbing the entirety of the pain they felt in their deaths all at once. Unfortunately, this whole clock head thing also made it so that he lost all of his memories and can only communicate with the sinners as everyone else just hears clock ticking. This pretty much sets the mood for everything to come, and from this point onwards, Dante serves as the manager of the sinners under an organization known as Limbus Company. Their job? Go to the specified locations, get the mysterious golden bows contained inside, and get out in enough pieces for Dante to put everyone back together. The story is based directly on Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, with Dante and Vergilius playing their characters' respective roles, adjusted to fit into the setting of the city. The game's opening mirrors that of the story, and the rest of the story then mirrors Dante's journey through hell. Similarly, all of the sinners are also taken from classical literature. In order of the game's own listing, those are Yi-san, based on the protagonist of Korean short novel The Wings and named after its author, Faust, Don Quixote, Yoshihide from Japanese short story Hellscreen, Mersal from The Stranger, Honglu based on not any specific character but the entirety of Chinese novel Honglu-mang, Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights, Ishmael from Moby Dick, Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment, Emile Sinclair from Demian, Odysseus from The Odyssey, and Gregor Samsa from The Metamorphosis. I am admittedly a giant classical literature nerd, so seeing all of these characters reimagined into Ruina's setting is one of my favorite parts of this game. While I do think some changes like making Faust or Odysseus into women are very questionable for reasons that will be instantly obvious to anyone who has read the books, others, like turning Sansa into a victim of super soldier experimentation, are genius and also tie back into the narrative of even LobCorp. Each sinner gets a chapter, or canto, dedicated to them and their personal struggles that become more strained as they grow closer to the Golden Bow. I'm honestly blown away at how this game progressively gets better with every single chapter, and I'm starting to get worried that they're gonna ride themselves into a corner. And whilst I don't think that it has gotten as good as Ruina at its best yet, it's certainly gotten close. The gameplay meanwhile is split into two different battle types, though you set them up in the same way by selecting your sinners for the fight and what ego they have equipped, which we'll get to shortly. Once you've upgraded your sinners enough, they will have 3 skills in their moveset, as well as a defensive maneuver that can be toggled at any time. Each turn you have to choose between 2 of them randomly, though it could also just end up being the same one twice. When fighting abnormalities or bosses, the combat is mostly like the one in Ruina, though there are some differences, like your deck of cards per character being replaced by the sinners and their respective skills. The core change, however, is the ego. See, every skill is color-coded to correspond to a certain ego resource. When you have enough of them, you'll be able to use any ego you have equipped on your character that would need them. In this game, ego are basically super moves, but they use up your sanity, and if your sinner's sanity falls too low, their ego corrodes and they go berserk and become uncontrollable for a turn, giving them a big risk-reward factor. On top of that, low sanity also gives debuffs, which counts for both your party and your enemies. Selecting multiple skills of the same affinities in the same turn also activates resonance that activates passive buffs and skills from your party as well. All of the ego rules and sanity stuff still applies to standard battles, though the whole clashing system is significantly simplified, because instead of picking and choosing who does what depending on the character's speed die, you instead have to just draw a line as the game basically chooses for you. These are a lot less strategic than the boss and abnormality ones, and consequently a lot less fun, but thankfully they're not too bad. The key difference from Ruina is that the game is significantly easier, which is kind of its best aspect when you think about it, because the entire thing is balanced entirely around your base units and their base ego. See, to gain new ego and sinner IDs, which are variations of your sinners with completely different stats and movesets and whatnot, you have to deal with the game's gacha system. Unlike most gacha, it does not have any pity roll system or something of the sort, and so is completely dependent on actual RNG. However, the base units are all perfectly good at their job, and as of May 2024, it is entirely possible to get through the game without even interacting with the gacha aspect once. As this is a free-to-play game, it genuinely feels like this is the first ever gacha I've played to not be predatory, but to actually just be a good game. But unfortunately, there are some caveats after all. Firstly, maintaining a game like this is hard and expensive, and Project Moon seriously underestimated it. Limbus ended up siphoning a majority of their staff and funds as an indie studio just to keep the necessary stream of updates going so the game doesn't fall apart or lose its player base, which is why the Distorion Detective game has yet to leave the ideas phase. And of course, there's the enkephalon system. This is one of those games where to play a level, you have to use a certain finite resource. In this case, 20 enkephalon per stage, though dungeons and plot stages use batteries instead, which are, you guessed it, made by converting more enkephalon. The issue arises from the fact that you never have all that much of it going around in the first place, and while granted the game does give you a lot of items to instantly refill it, when you run out of them, you'll have to wait in real time for them to refill, which can be a pretty lengthy process. They should have just made this game an early access project like Ruina or something, because god knows, I would be way more willing to recommend this game to people without having to acknowledge that it's a gacha, even if it's the best one I've ever played. Before I wrap up the video, I'd like to just throw out some miscellaneous spoiler thoughts for all of the series, so if you don't want to see that, skip to the outro section. I think what really made me get invested in these games was the sheer brilliance of how Roland and Angela's relationship develops in Ruina as it progresses. Roland is the kind of character who, in his self-destructive ways, has ended up ruining the lives of everyone around him until the only person who's left to ruin is himself. And he might as well have reached that point already. Angela is kind of the same way, since she believes that if she isn't allowed to have happiness, then nobody should be. So Roland constantly asking her throughout the game if she regrets anything is kind of reflected back on himself. He knows that what he's doing is wrong, he just doesn't care anymore. anymore, while Angela, on the other hand, has never even questioned whether what she's done is right. She just seeks her own satisfaction, which is to say, forgetting all of the bullshit that happened back in Lobotomy Corporation and becoming human. The two choosing to forgive each other is more than a matter of setting aside their needs for vengeance. They're basically forgiving themselves as well. All of this is to say, fuck Carmen. Ayn might have been a terrible fucking psycho, but Carmen is flat out fucking evil. Yes, I will cause everyone to distort just to fuck with the world because I didn't choose to be left alive. I hear there. Obviously there's a lot more to it than that, but that does bring up a very good point, being that in Dante's notes he acknowledges that if all it takes for someone to distort is being pushed to their emotional limit, then there would be millions of them running around right now, right? But there aren't. Since from Ruina we know that Carmen is the one responsible for causing distortions, I think it has something to do with the golden bows. I think it's more of a combination of that and Carmen's brain and nerves that disappeared during the White Nights. I feel like they got absorbed into it, kind of like how X was. My current theory is that the closer one is to a golden bow, the likelier they are to distort, as they're closer to Carmen's field of influence. But it's also not a guarantee, because we have seen from people like Zhao that they can end up rejecting Angela's words and instead manifest a really fucking powerful ego instead. The bows being related to distortions would explain why the company is being sent out to get them in the first place, since we know from the deleted credits sequence of Ruina that the whole reason LCB exists is to track down and deal with the distortions, right? And it would also explain why Heathcliff distorted when they were right next to it, or why every one of the sinners can resonate with the other bows, possibly because of Dante's head being one. So that begs the question, can Dante distort? And if not, then who the fuck is he? Another really interesting thing that recent Limbus updates brought up is the fact that all of the books the characters are based on are canon as mirror worlds. I'm going to assume that the female characters will still be gender bent in those worlds, but this raises a big possibility of future chapters involving the original stories a lot more than before, which particularly in the case of Faust would end up having some insane implications. Lastly, I also want to talk about Vergilius real quick. Him breaking his contract with the company in Canto 6 basically voids his possibility of getting Lapis back, which was the whole point of him joining LCB in the first place. And I really hope they get into this in later cantos, because this implies that he's either grown attached enough to Karen that he's willing to let Lapis go, or that there has been some other development going on off screen wherein he has come to the conclusion that making sure nobody else loses someone important to them by having their entire being overridden by another ID is more important than bringing Lapis back. Whichever one way, I really hope they do give Vergilius a lot more to do from now on. If nothing else, he definitely needs to get involved with the party when they eventually confront the library, considering Tomari coming back was the catalyst for him eventually joining LCB in the first place. And I don't think he'd be able to forgive Angela and Roland easily for it. So yeah, that was my little spoiler ramble, so let's finish the video. And thus concludes this little look back on Project Moon's big franchise without an actual name. I think about it, I should have just called it the HamHamPangPang series or something. I actually wanted to have an entire section dedicated to mini reviews of each origin story of the Sinners and Roland, but that ended up being way too long, so I scrapped it. Either way, I've definitely grown to love these games over the last year or so, and highly recommend anyone with an extremely high pain tolerance to give them a go. I'd say they're pretty good. With that, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I wish you all a wonderful morning, day, evening, or night. Cheers.